Hello and welcome to Self Talk. I'm Rachel Astarte. Award-winning author and TEDx speaker Christian de la Huerta is a sought-after spiritual teacher, personal transformation coach, and leading voice in the breathwork community. His book, Awakening the Soul of Power, the first of a three-part series, Calling All Heroes, was released just this past year in October. He has been described by music icon Gloria Estefan as a balm for the soul. Christian, welcome.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm honored to be on the show. It's not every day that I get to speak with the poet laureate of beautiful Bucks County, Pennsylvania.
Well, it's a pleasure speaking with you too. And I know we have so much to talk about. So I'm going to ask a pretty obvious question, but I think it will lead in nicely to the rest of the episode today. How did you get started in all of this work?
That's a big question. I've always had a sense of mission, like a desire to serve humanity or the sacred, however I interpreted that at different points in my life. Like when I was young, I grew up in a very Catholic family, so I thought I wanted to be a priest. Then realized in my later teens that religion didn't have room for me, for who I am. So, so later in my, as I was approaching 30, I began to look towards the East. So I started exploring both the mystical traditions of the West and the traditions of the East. But that mission, that sense of wanting to make a difference, to help human beings get free from our self-made prisons, it's still what drives all of what I do, what drives the theme of this book that I just released.
Beautiful. And how did you get started with writing?
My first book came out 20 years ago. I was actually approached by a publisher, one of the New York publishing houses back then. And I had a simultaneous yes, and the honor of being, like kind of anointed in the shoulder with a mission, and a yikes. Like it was like, yes, yikes. Because I didn't, I'd never written before. I'd never written a book before. I didn't want to be in the public eye. I'm primarily introverted, and which means that I process things internally before I speak them, and that I'm probably most comfortable by myself in nature. And it's that sense of mission that we're talking about that allows me to do what I do and to speak all over the world.
Beautiful. Yeah, I get that as a self-proclaimed introvert who loves nature myself. And and one of the things that
I figured that given your shamanic studies, I figured that you would understand.
Yeah, I do. And it is something I think that you're aware of, or one can be aware of very, very early on in life, that somehow as a child, you just feel at home outdoors or in nature or with your bare feet on the ground or whatever it is. I used to talk to trees, and I guess I still do.
I still do.
Now that I think about it.
I still do.
Yeah.
And in this year of pandemic, it's like that. It's been a blessing to be
exactly
to have that connection to self. Like, thank goodness that I enjoy my own company.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know, when people say I'm bored, it's like I don't even understand that.
I don't understand that word either, but I can see it's like you're bored because you haven't opened the door to go out, not necessarily even literally outside, but open the door even into your inner self.
Thank you.
To find out how much there is, how much richness is there.
Oh my God. And what a universe to explore in there.
Yeah, that's something. And being lonely too. Sometimes I don't understand. I mean, I understand it, of course, need for human connection, but when there's so much life around us all the time, I'm looking at the trees right now, waving in the wind. I'm like, oh, hi.
Yeah, I totally get that. I never feel lonely. Like in this last year pandemic, I've been in a long distance relationship,
Mm,
which is the reason that, that I go to Bucks County and
oh,
Lambertville, New Jersey so often.
mm,
But I do, so I get the skin hunger part of it, but I'd never feel lonely.
yeah, yeah. It's interesting. Well, so that's a great way to segue, I think, into awakening the soul of power. Um, so let's talk about personal power for a second, and we can dive in anywhere. There are a couple of shades of personal power that I want to get into, but you talk about selling out on your personal
Mhm.
power and how to free ourselves from self-sabotage, which is one of the ways to do that. Can you talk a little bit about uh, what that means? What, first of all, what is personal power, and how do we sabotage it?
Yeah, of course. I think most of us have an ambivalent relationship to power.
Mm,
We want it, but we're afraid of it. And as I've been doing retreat work on that theme and developing my thinking about that for the last 10 years, what I've realized is that at core, we fear that we might abuse it.
mm,
And no wonder, like all we have to do is turn on the news on any given day
yeah,
and witness at least one abuse of power.
right.
And so, what good hearted person wants to do that? We've also been conditioned, to think that power is a negative thing, it's a bad thing. So, power corrupts.
Mhm.
Absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Right.
So, what good-hearted person wants to be corrupted?
Mm,
Add to the mix the fact that we've been conditioned that the emotions are weakness, and we hate conflict. We avoid confrontation. Put all that into a mix, and what happens is we end up selling out on our power. We end up saying yes when inside we feel no.
mhm,
Um, we end up selling short on our beliefs, our dreams, our convictions, our boundaries, what works for us, what doesn't work for us, and settling for an illusion of security,
mm,
for a false sense of acceptance,
mhm,
and for morsels of pseudo love.
mm.
And none of that is a smart strategy. It's not effective. It doesn't really work.
What is pseudo love?
Pseudo love is you know, like like a semblance of love, because if we're selling out, if we're selling out the hugeness, the magnificence of who we are, and settling for, because we're avoiding, we're settling for a false sense of peace,
Mhm,
or we don't want to. We feel like if we really said what's in our mind, we might cause conflict in our relationships, or even worse, we might end up alone. Um, we're not being authentic,
mhm,
right? So when we present ourselves as less as who we are,
mhm.
that's all that we can get back in return.
Right.
So we cannot expect full on, love, if we're not presenting ourselves as that.
Right, right. And it's a scary thing to do because you're putting yourself out there. Like you said, there's a fear that I'll be rejected, I'll be alone. And you mentioned conflict a couple of times, and I'd love to chat about that for a second. A lot of people are averse to conflict because of what you said. It's high risk. It's not pleasant. I might, be butting heads with somebody that I don't want to do. Um, when I work with conflict, either with couples or individuals in my therapy practice, we talk sometimes about how conflict can be positive because conflict is an opportunity to heal something that isn't, that's abrading against itself, whatever the ideologies or the thoughts or the feelings. And um and I wonder if that rings true to you, the idea of conflict as an opening.
Of course, and you're right. It's not fun. Having a difficult conversation is not fun for anybody. I guess there are a few people who get off on
Mm,
locking horns. I certainly don't. Um, but it's a necessary part of life,
mhm,
right? It's the alternative is like stifling who we are.
yeah,
And what, to complete the earlier thought, what they didn't tell us about that quote, power corrupts.
Mm.
is that it specifically was talking about political power, not
Right.
interpersonal power.
Right.
And so the message of this book is that there is a way to express our power and to be all of who we are and to have clear boundaries and to no longer settle for less without it needing to be abusive. It's to that we can express our power in a way that is not hierarchical, that is not about fear, force, that it doesn't require putting somebody down, putting our knee to their neck in order for us to prop ourselves up and feel powerful. That there is a way that we can, navigate conflict, get through power struggles, and avoid getting into power struggles without selling out on ourselves in a way that is congruent with our innate nature.
Right. Right. And you speak in the book about this is a journey, and you bring up Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey. And this is something that many people know about, some people don't know about. And you state that we are all heroes of our own journey, basically. And I wonder, I can hear some people saying, well, I'm not a hero. I'm the last thing that ever would be a hero. Could you speak to those people, please, and explain what you mean when you say we're all heroes?
Yeah, and I get that. I struggle with that word. And I start the book out by saying that I'm an unlikely person to be writing about personal heroism and what it means to be a hero in the 21st century and stepping into our power. I was raised in a communist regime in my first 10 years of life, which was very hierarchical. The state controlled you and everything that you did or tried to. And also the Catholic Church is also very hierarchical and patriarchal and power over.
Yeah.
And COVID has kind of forced us or given us the opportunities to expand what we think of as heroic. Like before that, most of us would have probably thought, like a superhero, with a cape, or maybe a warrior or first responder.
Right.
Now we include our healthcare practitioners, our doctors and our nurses and our respiratory therapists, and maybe even our grocery store clerks and our delivery people who at some point were placing their lives at risk to keep the rest of us fed and provided for. And what about the rest of us? It's like I sometimes it feels like just waking up in the morning and maintaining a sense of self and equanimity and inner peace in this crazy, chaotic world of ours, that even that is a heroic feat. And so the way that I write about heroism is, like understanding what the ego mind is and how we break free from it, so that we're not approaching life from its fearful, reactive, defensive mode with all of its shenanigans and machinations. That is nothing short of heroic.
Yeah, for sure. In fact, that's a beautiful segue into, let's talk about the ego. And there are so many different definitions and thoughts that we have about the ego, and it can be an ally, but it can also be one of our biggest blocks to that inner, what I'm hearing you say is the inner heroic work. This isn't easy stuff. To step into your power sounds gorgeous. I want it on a t-shirt. I've stepped into my power, but it's not that easy. And you have to weed through so much self-doubt, so much programming. You said with, living in a communist state and the rules of the Catholic Church, we all in our own ways have that kind of language and self-talk that's created from what we heard as children, and the ego kind of has to manage all of that. So what's your take on the ego and how it shows up on this journey?
Yeah, I knew that you'd appreciate this, and being a therapist. And you're right, there's so much confusion about what the ego is. Most of us, when we hear the word, if we know the word, we'll think arrogance, inflated sense of self, having a big ego. And it is that, but it's a whole lot more than that.
Mhm.
And then maybe if like you or me, if we took Psych 101 in college, then we'll think, oh, maybe Freud's model personality, the id, the ego, the superego. And that's not what I'm talking about. There's things that apply, but the way that I'm talking about the ego and teach about the ego is more derived from Eastern teachings. And it's the sense of self, right? It's a part of the mind that makes sense of an overwhelming amount, what would be overwhelming amount of sensory information. It can reach into the past, project into the future, and somehow weave all of that into a coherent sense of personality. Like, this is Christian, that's Rachel. It's like we think about the Latin name Homo sapiens sapiens, who we are as humans. We can translate that to mean humans who know that we know, right? So it's that self-reflexive consciousness.
Mhm.
It's both what allows us to reflect back upon ourselves, and it's both a leap in consciousness in terms of evolution. As far as we know, we're the only species that has a sense of self,
Mm.
and it's also the source of all our suffering.
Yeah.
Because up until the time where the ego construct developed in humans, we felt at one with everything else, with all
Right.
of creation, like the rest of the creatures.
Right.
And so the birth of the ego was then, and this is from Ken Wilber, was then mythologized as the expulsion from the garden.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was like the first split in consciousness. And now, because we have an individual identity, a sense of self, an individual personality, we can feel lonely, we can feel rejected, we can have abandonment issues, we can have a sense of our own mortality. So it's both a blessing and a curse.
Mhm.
And there's so much more to say. The whole third or fourth of the book, the beginning of it is about the ego, because it is the key. Understanding it is the key to freedom. It is the key to having the relationships that we dream of and the kind of life
Yeah.
that we deserve to have, and a sense of personal empowerment and a life that's filled with meaning and purpose. And here's a simple metaphor, because I know we don't have the time that would really require to understand the ego. But a great metaphor that's a beautiful visual that helps us get it. It's like if you put a baseball in the center of a stadium, that's what the ego is.
Mhm.
Who we are is actually the stadium. And we've allowed this tiny, tiny, tiny part of who we are to think that it is all of who we are.
Yes. Yeah.
And to make some really important, consequential choices about our life, about our relationships, about what we do and not do from its very limited and always fear-based perspective.
Yeah. 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 And I think there are levels also of the ego. We talk about the underdeveloped ego, which is that one that I think you're talking about, which is, always wanting to run the show. And
Yes.
the underdeveloped ego doesn't seem to understand, well, as you said, it's that split, that rejection from the garden, where, and again, we're bringing Ken Wilber up again, the concept of non-duality, where we're not split from the divine, we are the divine. And then the ego, once it's over here, says, okay, I'm running the show. And you know what I mean? And that's the underdeveloped ego. But we need that ego. We
Yes.
need that sense of self. We need to develop it. I think it's Carolyn Pearson who talks about it being the container for the soul,
Yes.
right? Because if we didn't have that, the spirit would be flying all over the place, and we wouldn't be able to channel its power, right?
Yes. Yes.
Of the power of our individual spirits, which is
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. So yeah, so what good is the stadium if we don't have a baseball?
right, right. It's just there,
It just sits there,
Yeah,
enjoying its own beauty, but
right. It's not moving the entity, the cosmic entity forward, I think.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And I imagine that people, like I'm in a lot, totally in 100% in alignment with what you said. And because I've also struggled with, like, being the divine, or like, how does, like, here's the way that I relate to it, as like the divine lives in us and we live in it.
Mm-hmm.
And that takes it out of like, oh my God, who do I think I am? That got it, that I, that I'm an expression of the divine.
Right.
It's yeah, but it's interesting, because if we're gonna go even by the Western spiritual traditions that claim that God is omnipresent,
Mm-hmm.
then wait a minute, then don't tell me that God is everywhere except for ourselves.
Well, yeah.
And if we want to take it a step further, except for the bedroom and the genitals.
Right. Exactly. Well, listen, I think it was Freud actually who said, God made man in his image, not the other way around.
Yes.
So the idea is we are omnipresent, we are omnipotent. God made man in his image, not the other way around. So it's not a man in the sky on a cloud, being
Right.
human. It's
Right.
it's the divine. And Jesus is, the kingdom of God is within you.
Yes.
And then there's the Hindu perspective. Atman is Brahman. Atman is Brahman is what you just said, the individual soul embedded within the universal soul.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
and there's just apps, and then we go back to the non-duality where there is no
Right.
separation.
Right.
So that leads us to what you refer to, I think this is the connection, the soulful self, right, in your book. Can you
Yes.
describe that term for the listeners?
Yes, I think the way that I think about it is when we step out of the realm and the limited perspective of the ego, and we reconnect with our stadium nature, to stay with that metaphor, it's like, to me, that is what is the soulful self. And when we step out of its the limited reality of the ego, it's like we step into a realm that is it's filled with miracles and magic, for lack of another word, in which miracles and magic are commonplace. Where, like, to use a Jungian term, synchronicity is part of life. And things that the little ego could never conceive of become, like, part of living. And it's almost like it has a different set of rules, and even maybe physics. And I know that sounds hard it is hard to describe by definition, because we're trying to describe it through the language and perspective and words of the ego. So that's why we have to fall back on words like magic and miracles. And there are, like you were talking about earlier, that are alluding to, there's some teachings that say that you've got to kill the ego. Because it is the source of all our suffering, and that's true. My understanding of it, my perspective of it is that as long as we're in a body, in this third dimensional reality, that we need to have an ego, and it's not all bad. And that it's good to have a sense of self. So rather than killing it, what we're going for is healing it, so that we're no longer reacting to unresolved past traumas and unhealed issues and suppressed emotions. So that's what I understand as healing it, so that we can reintroduce choice, right? And rather than reacting, but the ego is all about reacting, so that we can reintroduce choice back into the equation, and choose to how we're going to show up. So, and so rather than thinking, allowing the ego to continue thinking that it is running the show, that it is the sun, we're like taking it outside of that place and putting it back in orbit around the sun, in service to the sun. Call that the higher self, call it our own sacred piece of our own piece of sacred real estate, call it the soul, call it whatever you want to call it.
I think that's exactly right. It has a place. It's just, and I think that's it's not killing the ego so much as developing the ego and training it to to have its place, to help the entire entity of the being, the mind, body, spirit being that we all are, to do what it's supposed to do while we're here. And God only knows what that is, but but one thing is certain, we're here for some reason, and whatever lesson it is, or lessons they are that we're here to learn, it's quite an adventure. So,
and I love how you speak about it as the mind, body, spirit being, because we're so, like, like that was the first split was that, right? The birth of the ego. And then we continue splitting ourselves, right? Here's my body, and then there's my mind, and there are my emotions.
Right.
and there's my spirit, and where in reality, the more holistic, the more shamanic, the more Eastern approach to it is like one of wholeness, like it's just one being.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's part of the work, at least that I'm doing with therapy, is getting those pieces kind of put back together again, the mind, body, spirit aspect, and saying, you know, these things have to work in conjunction with one another, you know, because they all have a part. You can't be up in your head all the time and ignore your body, you know, or you can have your mind and your body working together and then forget your divinity, you know, or your connection to primal unified awareness, as the Taoists call it, you know. So that it just is, you know what I mean? So
Yeah.
so I appreciate what you're saying there. So as we I could talk to you all day. I hope you will come back.
I know you and I, you and I could just one thing we've mentioned we could spend an hour on.
I know, it's so true. Maybe we'll do that next time. But I think it's really important to get an overview of, especially of this book, because I think it's an important one for people to really to read. And one of the questions that I want to close with is, how do we start getting to know, or getting to develop or create that soulful self? What's a and I know that may be a big question, so baby steps. How might one?
And it is a big question. Yes. Two things I would say, and only half kiddingly, get the book,
Yeah.
right? Because it does walk you. I've designed it intentionally like short chapters and interactive. So each chapter has questions or practices at the end to help us integrate the teachings into our lives, which is the whole purpose, right? So that it's not just a good idea, or like we're hypothetical. It's like, no, these teachings can actually change our lives and how we do relationships. And so then like another practice, anything that we can do in terms of self-observation, like that's the key. Like whether it's a meditation practice or whatever it is, anything that is going to support our ability to reflect back up on ourselves and to understand who we are and why we do what we do and the patterns that we get stuck in, right? So like Carl Jung said, making the process of enlightenment is making the subconscious conscious.
Right.
So anything we can do towards that, whether it's a therapy practice or self-awareness, meditation, mindfulness practice, that's the beginning. And it's really the practice, right? So that we are no longer adrift in this sea of reactivity where we're at the effect of other people and their expectations and at the effect of subconscious drivers of behavior that we don't even understand why we do the things we do,
Right.
And why we feel the way we do. So it all starts there. Like, and no wonder they used to have at the entrance of the old temples, know thyself. Like that's the beginning step.
Yeah. Yep. And breathe.
Oh my God, it's all about the breath, right?
Yeah.
All about the breath.
Yep. And that really is. And you mentioned meditation practice, or whatever practice it is that allows you to drop into what's here, get to know it, get to know what's present, and get to know what maybe what your blocks are, or how does your ego, what does your ego need to come to the good, to the light side? I don't want to say light and dark, but you know, the more functional side of helping the greater being. Yeah.
Yes. And understanding the patterns. And like sometimes it feels like if we start zooming out and looking at our relationships, rather than feeling victimized by what this one did or the other one didn't do, it's like, wait a minute, let's get real. Who is the one common denominator in every one of those relationships? And so why do we keep attracting that kind of person or that kind of relationship? And so that sometimes it feels like we're in the same boring play with a different actor, but that's like, I've been here before.
Yep. Wanting the play, wanting Romeo and Juliet to end differently, but that never does. Never does. So we're gonna have to change the whole play. Yeah,
I love that.
I don't know. I always do. I'm like, maybe this time. So let's talk about what's coming up for you. Obviously, the book is out, so and available at your website, which is soulfulpower.com, on Amazon. I
Yeah.
assume other booksellers, if you want independent booksellers, they are independent online
Yeah.
booksellers. They're there too. So what's coming up for you?
Yeah, thank you for letting people know where they can get the book. Yeah, wherever the books are sold, it's available. I'm also launched a virtual program, a virtual coaching program. It's a year long, but accessible, right? So because we're so busy and overscheduled, what I'm loving about this program is that I get to stretch out the teachings over the course of a year. And so that means that I get to deliver them piecemeal, like just a bite size at a time, with, like the book, that the key is interactivity, like applying these teachings to our lives and integrating them into our lives. And also with a system of accountability. So a coaching call with me every couple of weeks. In the intervening weeks, the groups are, and I'm keeping them all intimate too, 20, 30 people at most, so that there's a sense of familiarity and safety around them. And that may change over time, but at least for now, I'm really appreciating that part of it. And so in the intervening week, they meet in dyads or triads, and it could be a short 10, 15-minute meeting, but just designed to keep us accountable, to keep us doing what we said that we were going to do.
Okay.
And the other thing that I'm loving is that I get to use themes from all my retreats, so what it means to live heroically, understanding the ego mind. That's kind of the focus of the first quarter of the year. Then we talk about personal empowerment, like we were talking about before, then doing relationships consciously, and attracting the kind of relationships that have a chance of working, and that can support our spiritual growth and evolution, which to me is ultimately what we're here for. And then life purpose and stepping into conscious leadership. And I just launched the first group in January, and then this May, June, we're launching the second cohort.
Okay, so there would be time for people to sign up for the second cohort if they
Yes.
and they can do
Yes.
that through soulfulpower.com. Yeah.
Yes.
Oh,
Yes. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you for
beautiful.
reminding me to say that.
Of course, it's fine. In fact, in the show notes, we're going to have all of the links, ways that you can follow Christian, and we'll make sure that's all there. But for now, of course, I hate to cut this short, but it's been a pleasure having you, Christian, and I appreciate you being on Self Talk.
Same here. Thank you again so much for having me, and thank you for all you do and all the lives that you impact through the show and in your shamanic and therapy work.